Welcome to the Growth Boss Podcast, where we seek out the secrets to high-performance campaigns from some of the smartest marketers in the world. I'm your host, Jared Smith. Today, I have copywriter Kayla Hollatz with me, and she's going to teach us how she takes brands from 72,000 to 1.9 million in 1 year. Kayla, thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Jared. I'm so excited to talk about website copywriting.
Awesome. So for people who aren't familiar with you, would you mind just sharing a quick 60-second rundown of your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So in December, it'll be 10 years of being a website copywriter for primarily creative entrepreneurs, but also other SaaS companies as well, as long as they are serving entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs are definitely my go-to people, and I love being able to serve them, especially through website copywriting. But I really love to be able to weave in website strategy, conversion strategy, SEO, which of course you do so well. So yeah, it's been really wonderful just to be able to partner with them on being able to bring their websites again to that next level, whether it is elevating their messaging with their tone of voice, or whether it's really just beefing up some of those strategies and making it so that they're a little bit more future proof.
Yeah, that's awesome. And congratulations on 10 years.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited. I don't know how I'm going to celebrate, but we'll see how it goes.
Good. So tell us, you've obviously worked with a lot of different brands, one of which, of course, you took from 72,000 to 1.9 million, extremely impressive. When a new client comes to you, what's kind of step one for you to help, get them off and going?
Absolutely. So the first thing really is for me to understand their business strategy. So I want to be able to take a behind the scenes look into their offers, understand what's working, what's not. And typically, a brand or a business strategist is going to do this work, not necessarily your website copywriter. But I do believe it's really important, we look at websites as that central hub of your business. And so it's really important for me, as well as others, to be able to understand, okay, what is it that you're trying to convey? Who are, those ideal members of your audience? Who do you want it to be marketing to? How do we best do that? What is working? What's not? Kind of auditing all of those things is a really important first step, I would say, for most projects and certainly for website copywriting.
Yeah. And for most of your clients, where you kind of do this strategy session, which, is really important. What percentage of them do you feel like have their act together and are doing a good job?
That is a really good question. That's a sneaky question too. But I would say at least 75% of them come to me with some sort of idea of like, hey, even if this is just kind of a working version, here's kind of what we're thinking for our mission statement, or here are some of the values that we believe in. And I do send a questionnaire initially too, just so that I can kind of gauge how much work that they've done. And, some businesses also come with a whole brand voice guide, which is something that I can do as a companion piece to the website copywriting projects. But, you don't necessarily always get those resources. So I'd say maybe about 25% of the time, people are really in a stage of, I know I need to have these elements and I don't necessarily. And so that's usually where I'll work with them to decide, is it worth it for us to take that, back step and really think about brand voice and all of those elements I just talked about and beyond? Or, do we know enough to be able to get started? So yeah, those are some things I think about.
Okay, good. So once you've kind of outlined, okay, here's what they have going on, here's what's working, here's what's not, what's the next step?
So the next step for me would be to kind of create some sort of semblance of a sitemap, and then that'll help me to be able to determine that website navigation. So of course, a sitemap is usually where we're starting to understand, okay, based on the goals that you have, the strategy that you have for your business, what are some of the pages that maybe, if you're coming in with a website, are there any pages that we need to delete? As long as that's not necessarily, of course, affecting your SEO strategy, because that's something to keep in mind too.
Absolutely.
I'm sure that's something that you would bring into the conversation as that expert. But I think, it's really important just to be able to simplify some of the things that are there. A lot of times I think we're coming from, a generation of website builders that would create as many pages as possible. And now we're kind of trying to get a little bit more into, okay, what are those main keywords? And we'll talk about that later on too. But it's good just to think about, okay, that main sitemap. And then when you're thinking about website navigation as well, in tandem with that, I typically recommend having somewhere around, 4 to 6 website links just that are up in that top website navigation. I'm sure we both have seen the websites where you feel like there's too many actions to take place on this navigation bar. I have no idea where to go.
Exactly.
Right. And so you can use like those drop down functionalities if, let's say, you have a services link on your navigation bar and you want to be able to call out some of those. But maybe you don't necessarily need to have 30 all listed there on your drop down. You can
Yeah.
just kind of keep it to some of those like most important things. And so that's another, kind of thing that we get to talk about before we get into the nitty gritty of actually writing is all of the strategic steps that we're taking are getting us closer and closer to answering that question of like, what are we really here to do? What are
Yeah.
we really trying to accomplish? And, the deliverable might look like a sitemap or this, suggestion of website navigation and some other things we talked about, but it's all kind of getting us closer to that goal.
Okay. And what percentage of that kind of sitemap strategy is determined by your gut and talking with the client? And they're like, hey, here's what
Mhm.
people are asking about. Here's what people need versus the analytics and what is actually
Mm.
going on maybe on their existing site, which may be a good thing, may not be a good site.
Absolutely. I would say that it's a blend of the two. I
Okay.
always like to be able to have clients send me those analytics or resources. Kind of one of my personal go-tos is I always say I'd rather have too much to look at than not enough.
Yeah.
So, my job is always to be able to decipher what is going to be most helpful. And so I love being able to have that. Not everybody necessarily has that at their disposal, but for those larger scope projects, I would say absolutely that's something that can be helpful. Otherwise, there are the small business owners that I work with that either have a smaller website where it's maybe anywhere between 4 to 10 pages
Sure.
overall, and so there's not necessarily too much of that happens as a part of the conversation. But I think it's really good just to again be able to understand kind of the scope of what the project is and then kind of allow that to decide more of those conversations. And I also, especially because I'm a website copywriter and I'm a contractor, I like to be able to connect with some of the other people too. Because one of the things I would say in this stage of the project is that a lot of times businesses are going to be hiring multiple people to work on the
Sure.
project, whether it's an agency that's working with multiple people or you're assembling your own team, so to speak. And so because I've worked with so many developers and designers and SEO experts and all different sorts of people, and of course I play nice with everybody, it's just always really fun to be able to hear the different processes that everybody brings to the table because
Sure.
everyone is a little different, and also understand, okay, who owns what. So that's usually a conversation that I have upfront. And anybody who's listening, I would recommend having that, especially if you're assembling your own team. So then, one, you're not necessarily having an overlap of people doing the same thing. And then two, people just know kind of what they own, so to speak. So they can
Yeah.
run with that, give you suggestions, and then maybe others can weigh in on it, but you kind of have a clear owner.
I love that. Very important. Okay, so you've got the sitemap created. You kind of understand here's the pages that we're going to need in order to convert our prospects. What's the next step after that?
So the next step is what I would consider content-based wireframes. So
Okay.
in the website design world, wireframes are fairly typical, but they're always going to have some sort of, design element to them. And so it's actually very rare for a copywriter to be bringing wireframing into the process. But even when I got started, almost 10 years ago now, I'm a very visual person. And I think a lot of clients, that will work with us don't necessarily think that writing is an inherently visual thing, because you're putting everything into text. But I think what's
Sure.
so great about kind of taking it back again to a content-based wireframe is instead of showcasing a design to the client, having those design conversations upfront, you're able to take it down even further
Yep.
and instead look at how is the content itself going to be organized, what's the layout of it, and we get to have some really really good conversations about not only strategy but conversions. We get to have conversation about call to actions, which I'll talk about next, like
Yep.
some of these very important elements that I think can be easy to overlook if a client looks at a typical design wireframe and goes, oh, I don't like that color there, or oh, I don't imagine a photo to go there in this. And it kind of allows us to have, some of those strategic conversations without getting distracted.
I love that. And I don't think I've ever worked with a copywriter that put together a wireframe. So I love that. And the reason, just so our audience can kind of get the bigger picture with this. So
Mhm.
most of the designers that I've worked with, web designers, they tend to be focused, I don't want to say exclusively, but mostly on just
Yeah.
the beauty of the website itself and not the conversion side. So working with a
Mhm.
copywriter or a business strategist like Kayla allows you to put the conversions first. And then I assume then the web design company can kind of take what you've put together and make that pretty, but within the framework that you've created.
That's exactly, Jared, what I do. And a lot of times I work with designers who love that I take that extra step to
Yeah.
do the content based wireframe because then they feel like, again, their biggest goal is to make things look beautiful. And
Yeah.
that's awesome. I want to be able to support them in that and not say this is something that you need to do instead. But I love that I'm able to integrate that part of my process. And so a lot of my friends have nicknamed me like the designer's best friend. And it's
Yeah.
because I do think in that very visual way, but I'm able to create something that still works strategically and will honestly give me what I need because I kind of like to joke with clients that all of us get the blank page syndrome, right? Like, I don't want to write from a blank page. That's scary to me. And I understand that it's scary to other people. And so I currently am in the process of creating more of a trademark methodology called WireFramework, which, of course, everything I'm talking about kind of makes sense why I would choose a name
Yeah.
like that. But it's so fun to start thinking about, okay, much like you said, I kind of do this intuitively. And of course, it's taken research and it's taken all this experience. But now my newest challenge is being able to figure out, okay, how do I take this methodology um, and then teach other people it? And so I'm going to continue doing that more and more and reiterating upon it. But I think it's really rare to be able to find something and kind of have it be how your brain works and realize,
Yes.
oh, I'm still doing that same part of my process 10 years later and clients are still responding to it. And to be honest, Jared, I send over my wireframes in Google Docs. So I am the biggest person in
Amazing.
saying use the free accessible tools that you
Yes.
have. And I used to feel nervous sending over that to clients because I felt like, oh, are they not going to think this is as
Yeah.
pretty
Yeah.
as a, design wireframe? But now I figure, that's not necessarily what they're paying me for. That's what they're
No.
paying the designer for. They're paying me for those insights. And so there's a lot of benefits to being able to have that as a part of this kind of overall process.
Absolutely. Great point. And that's exactly it. I mean, the gold that you're going to pull out of that is not, what the box looks like in the wireframe. It's all of the
Exactly.
meat that's going to be ultimately displayed in the page. So that's awesome. So what comes next
Wonderful.
after the wireframe?
Yeah, so I kind of lightly introduced this, but it's that whole idea of starting to think about your call to action, right?
Okay.
So a lot of times we abbreviate that to your CTA. And for a lot of people, this will become pretty intuitive as they're going through their pages. So on your services, most people are going to, want to book a discovery call, or, on other pages, it might be to sign up for your email list. All of those are pretty typical call to actions. And I usually say on a home page, it's totally okay to have a few different call to actions, right? Because
Sure.
you don't necessarily know exactly where you're going to be sending people. You do want to think more about that user journey of where you want people to go to figure out what those call to actions are. But I would say for most other pages, like your services page, a landing page, certainly some of these others that you're going to be using internally on your website, it's really great to just have one core call to action per page. And
Yep.
then, of course, because I'm a copywriter and I'd be remiss if I didn't say, being able to keep the button language the same. There are so many times where I'll see business owners that are saying on their buttons, it'll all lead to the same contact form, but every button is saying something different. Like,
Mm.
yes, I'm in. Yes, let's do this. And
Right.
it's
Right.
so confusing to that end user because they don't necessarily know exactly what comes next. So try to use language one. If you can have some sort of action oriented verb in there, always a good thing because you want to help people know what action they're taking, but also just be clear instead of clever. We talk
Yeah.
about it all the time in copywriting, but it's tried and true for a reason. You
Yeah.
don't have to be clever with it.
And that's a great point. I was listening to Alex Hermosi yesterday, a very successful
Mm,
entrepreneur, and he was kind of talking about the same thing. He's like, listen, sometimes you just got to dumb down your copy to a third grade level.
sure.
It's not because, nobody can understand anything higher than that. It just reduces the brain's ability or the amount of thinking that you have to do to figure out, okay, what am I trying to do next here? And
Mhm.
you're just making it super, super simple. Yes, get started, but you're using that throughout the copy and just trying to make it easier for your users. So one of the questions I have
Absolutely.
is, I have a client who has 3 calls to action on his page. You can
Mm.
text him, you can call him, or you can email him. This service-based business, is that maybe too much, or is that something that you think works okay because people want to contact businesses in different ways?
I could give my upfront suggestion,
Sure.
but I would also be curious if this was a business that already had a website. It sounds like that was running. I would almost think about using something like a heat mapping tool. So something like Hotjar, is such a fantastic tool to be able to see. Okay, instead
Yeah.
of me just maybe assuming what's going to be best, and I could ask some follow up questions about, are you getting more texts? Are you getting more phone calls? That seems like the most obvious way.
Right.
But I also think if you're really thinking about how your website functions, we do have these incredible tools that will also be able to measure and give us an idea and also show us some data to see, hey, is that user journey something where people actually are more often, clicking to be able to, call you? Or is it more often that they're going to be clicking the contact button so that they can
Mhm.
email you? And trying to measure some of that. It might
Yeah.
be difficult for some of those call to actions, texts and phone calls and things, but I do think it'll at least give you more of an idea.
Love it. Love it. The other
Mhm.
thing too is not just the quantity of leads from each of those channels, but maybe the quality too, where they could
Yeah,
say,
that's a
"Hey,
great
listen,
point.
maybe we get fewer text messages, but the people who do text us are actually, really high quality."
Absolutely. That's a great extra point. Yep,
Okay.
because you want to be able to not necessarily just look at, lead generation for the sake of it. And that's why I love that, we had talked about this e-commerce example of, somebody going from 72,000 to 1.9. Of course, they had invested in other things too, but
Sure.
website copywriting was a huge piece of that. And I think part of that, of course, is being able to think about, it's not just about how many more visitors can we get, because that is a great thing, but if they're not necessarily converting, that's not the primary thing we're looking at. And I think especially for service-based businesses, which is a lot of the work that I do too, you really want to look at those quality leads. So if you can, even on your contact form, I always recommend including some sort of form field that says, how did you hear about us? Because
Sure.
that can even be a great way to very easily and manually track down, are most of the people coming from referrals? Are most of the people coming from a certain traffic source? And that'll just help you learn a little bit more about that too. And hopefully then you can kind of reverse engineer and see, did they text me first? Did they email me first?
Yeah.
Kind of look at those things.
Love it. Okay. So we get our CTAs dialed in.
Yes.
Where are we going next?
Well, of course, we're going to your neck of the woods, Jared, where we are thinking about SEO research. So,
Okay.
again, to kind of determine it on the scope of the project and the people that are hired, I have plenty of projects where people will bring on a whole SEO team or another SEO consultant where they're able to go so far beyond what we consider, some of those on page basic SEO elements. And
Sure.
so, as a copywriter, again, I am a lot of times helping small business owners with some of that preliminary keyword research to be able to help them get started on, what are some of those targeted keywords that are best for these, smaller scopes of pages and figuring that out. But it is interesting because when I get to the larger scope projects, a lot of times they're bringing somebody else in. And so that ends up looking like my job is implementing a lot of the SEO strategy that is, currently being given to me, whether they're coming with briefs or whether they're just coming with a strategy document. And so it kind of
Hmm.
depends on this stage.
Yeah.
But I would say for those who are either DIYing their website or they're doing it with a very small team, I would always recommend to work with someone that's going to be able to own at least a portion of that process. Because even if you're, I'm sure you would say so too, even if you're able to get going with some of the on page SEO
Yeah.
before you're able to invest in the whole back end and the
Right.
holistic strategy, everything helps you get started.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say the number one issue that we run into is we get clients ranked, but because they
Mm,
didn't work with a copywriter or they didn't work with a conversion specialist, they're not getting the number of conversions that they should. And they're like, yeah, business is
sure.
up, but I'm not getting as much as what I had thought. And I'm like, well, your conversion rate is, 0.5%.
Yeah.
That's where you need to work with somebody like a Kayla to be able to bump that up.
Absolutely. And that kind of, my job in that respect would be to look at whatever is ranking, make sure that I maybe am coming in more as a strategist and copy editor, but not necessarily doing it to a point where then you're getting rid of that ranking. And
Sure.
so I think a lot of
Exactly.
times it does take somebody coming in who kind of knows knows what they're doing so
Yeah.
that you're not kind of getting rid of some of those results that you currently have. So
Yeah.
it's not damaging the ranking, but then you're also not necessarily feeling like you're at this conversion rate and oh well that's
Yep.
where you stay because of course
Right.
that seems like it's such a ripe opportunity and I
Yeah.
think there are more people who have those, especially if you're looking into your analytics, when you really start looking at, where are my backlinks and where do people seem to be landing on the most? Those are great places for you to focus on improving over time.
I love it. And I love that you go in, kind of with an open mind, not just looking to slash things because, I would say more often than not, SEO content and regular copy can be at war. And what I mean by that
Mm,
is, we're in a niche right now with one of our clients where the average number of words on a page in the industry that they're in is 5,000. Now, I would never recommend anybody write
no.
5,000 words if they're looking to convert somebody. But if we want to rank, that's just what Google likes in this particular industry. So going into it
Mhm.
saying, okay, we have to have, 5,000 words in order to rank, but how can we, maybe put these in accordion tabs or make it,
Sure.
beautiful or add some good calls to action up front in the content so that people can be converted, and not at the bottom of the page after they've read 5,000 words.
Absolutely. I love that you said that though, Jared, because I think those are, again, some of our greatest challenges can bring about our favorite opportunities to
Yeah.
start thinking about, okay, if this is what some of that is required, how do I organize it differently? And again,
Yes.
that's why I love that wireframing part of the project is because before I write a word and before we have to think about any messaging, we're able to have those conversations up front so that, okay, if this is what the data is showing us and we know that this is important, how do we do this, but in a way that's not necessarily going to feel like we have to basically serve the bots and we're no longer serving the human audience
Yeah.
that's coming to us because
Yeah.
that's not going to help our conversions like you said just as much as you're ranking great
Yeah.
but it's just a vanity ranking at that point
Correct.
if you're not helping people get to your services, so that's such a great point.
Yeah. I just want to point out to our audience that we are, 4 or 5 steps in to a
Yeah.
call about copywriting, and we haven't written any copy yet, which it
Yes.
just goes to show you the importance of this upfront research. And I feel like so many people are just so eager to just dive in and start writing without
Mhm.
really understanding, where the secret sauce is going to come from in that campaign.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that does come from, again, that like blank page syndrome where people feel like I just don't know exactly what
Yeah.
it is that I should write yet. And to me, these are all of those kind of puzzle pieces that you're putting together that most people overlook. But having that clearer idea, a lot of times, just even sometimes in my meetings or when I'm looking through the questionnaire answers, sometimes I'll have a Google Doc open and I'll just have random headlines that just kind of come to mind. So I'll jot them down or I'll
Sure.
have different pieces. And so I think it's just really helping that creative process go along when you kind of are able to look at it from a little bit more of that strategic, almost pragmatic sense. So
Yep.
both of those things can come together. And I'm really glad to see that, we are finding more ways to have SEO content and website copy in the more creative sense come together in that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you've met with the SEO team on the project.
Yes.
Are you going to start writing or are we doing more
Yes, we
research from
are
here?
finally
Okay.
writing. Yes, Jared, we are. We have hit that halfway point where strategy turns into the actual deliverable, which is
Yeah.
so wonderful. So, the next thing that I would say too is just implementing that brand voice. So, again, much like we talked about initially, if you do need to kind of take a step back and again think a little bit more about your brand voice, there are a few different exercises where you can do
Mhm.
that. So, one of them that I usually recommend is going in and creating kind of a brand dictionary, so to speak. So it's kind of just thinking about some words that you love, some words that you avoid. And then if you want to go even deeper than that, I really like to categorize some of those areas, especially in my separate brand voice intensive, where we go, okay, not just necessarily all this list of random words that we love, but what are the words that we typically use when we're describing our process?
Yeah.
What are the typical words that we use when we're describing our experience? All of these different things can kind of help us start to see, oh, okay, there's again a little bit more of a methodology
Sure.
behind this, and we can start to see how this framework behind our brand voice is coming together. So that's one thing. Another thing, too, is you can always record yourself, even if you hate your voice and
Sure.
listening back to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's just listening to how you naturally talk about the work that you do. And also, hopefully, that will help you also see, okay, is there jargon I'm using? What's a simpler way for me to say this thing? And even if
Love
it's
that.
hard for you to pick out some of that jargon, because a lot of the industries we work with can have that, have somebody in your life who really doesn't know anything about what you do. Like when you go to a dinner party and they still are asking you what you do,
Sure.
have them maybe listen to it and to say, can you actually understand what it is that I do in this succinct way. If not, let me simplify this more and more. So again, it kind
Yeah.
of goes with the recommendation you were talking about earlier, where it's like kind of putting it down to that like third grade level. But
Yeah.
again, that just helps you again with some clarity.
And how important, like we have a customer service team in one of my companies. We have
Mm.
3 full-time staff members. Do you ever kind of go through, customer service emails or threads and just kind of see how
Mhm.
they explain things to see if there's a, way to integrate some of that into the website?
Yeah, that can definitely be a part of the brand voice process because sometimes during that intensive that I do separately, I will, kind of ask some of those questions, look at some of the content that they currently have,
Yeah.
and then create some templates that they can start using to, create again some form of consistency. And a lot of times that brand voice guide can kind of act almost as a like welcoming employee onboarding type guide so that
Right.
everybody is speaking the same language. So if you have a large team, instead of this brand voice document being something where you feel like, wow, that was a great thing for us to go through, but it's just sitting here and we have no idea
Yes.
what to do with it. That's a way for you to continue being able to use it so everybody is
Mm,
using that same language, which is fantastic. So I
love
think
it.
that's a great place to go. And another thing that I would say that I really like to review too is looking at testimonials. I mean, it's always a great thing to look at client or customer reviews, to look at the words that they're using,
Yeah.
because just as important for brand voice is, we call it like voice of customer,
Yes.
VOC. And there's a lot of copywriters who, in the way that I go really deep into strategy, they go deep into that. And so
Mhm.
it's really cool to see kind of what people are able to pick out. And of course, with all of these different steps that I take, I do some of this, but don't necessarily take as deep of a dive. But it is a really great thing. And then I'm also able to a lot of times repurpose some of the excerpts from those testimonials on the website. So it's kind of a win-win for me to do that work too.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I love that. So we went through this process with that same company about 6 years ago. We spent a lot of time talking about our brand archetype, which we
Hmm.
landed on, I think, the Rebel or something. Is that
Yep,
kind of
I've seen
something
those.
that's important these days?
It's not necessarily something that I have incorporated into my work. I do know Kate Putnam is a really great brand psychologist and strategist, and
Yeah.
she goes really deep into those like 12 archetypes that I think you're talking
Sure.
about, and has a quiz for it. And I've done a lot of quiz writing myself, and so it's always fun to look at those. But I would say all of those things are only as helpful for as far as you can take them. So if your
That's a good
identity
point.
then as a rebel, if there's something about that that just makes something click and you go, oh, like this is the language we use, or this is the tone of voice that we have to have because of this, then I think it can be incredibly impactful. But then if you ever just feel like, well, we did this activity and I guess we know that we're rebels now, then maybe that wasn't necessarily the most important exercise.
Yeah.
But again, there are other exercises you can do. And so hopefully with me sharing, a few of them, it will help others be able to decipher, okay, based on maybe what I know about some of the resources that we have on hand, or whatever that looks like based on, kind of our
Yeah.
brainstorming process as a team.
Yep.
This is what we're thinking about. And the last thing I'll say about it too is when it comes to, having a company brand with a whole team and you're trying to kind of come up with one consistent brand voice, just know it's going to take a little bit of time. So that's
Yeah.
why, if there's a brand that comes to me and they have a large office and they're maybe even going to be expanding,
Yeah.
and they have never gone through an exercise like this, I usually do recommend to take that step back as much as they're chomping at the bit
Yeah.
to get excited about the
Yes.
website copywriting project. It's like, it's just going to help you so much internally.
Yep.
And it also, a lot of times, will give other employees a voice in the project and the brand voice side, because at least for me, I would rather have their input at that point. And then usually when I get to the website copywriting phase, I really appreciate when at least if you are going to get feedback from multiple people, have it come through one person. So it's just a really smooth
Smart.
process. So that's another thing that I would mention.
I love that. And I have to reiterate that for the brands that I've started as well, that is such an important piece of just taking your time, like really sit with it, let it marinate. I know for me, as I process through different things with our brand voice, like I may sit on things for a couple weeks and just really, try to figure out, is that really who we are? Is there something else that we
Yeah.
should be adding and revisiting it, meeting with somebody like you that can kind of poke holes in it like every 6 months to where it's like, okay, here's where we're at 6 months ago.
Mhm.
How are things going? what are your customers saying now? Like, where do you feel like the holes are so that you can continue to strengthen it? And that's where you have these major brands that are crystal clear about who they are.
Yes.
They didn't nail it the first time either. They've continued
No.
to iterate and refine that over time too.
Absolutely. And that was actually going to be one of my other points.
Oh,
It's
okay.
just like don't be afraid to experiment. I think
Yeah.
so many people feel like, they have to get perfection at one go. And so then the whole entire website team has that on their shoulders. And
Yeah.
it's not the best way that even high performing copy comes together. The people that I know who are high performers in their industry, a lot of times they are the ones that are willing to look at things from a different perspective. They're willing to take in the data. They're also willing to look at, okay, when were my assumptions actually wrong?
Yeah.
And how can I look at this a little bit differently? So, yeah, it always evolves over time. You don't have to put the pressure on yourself to get it right. And I mean, that's even coming from a copywriter where it's my job to get at least as close to
Sure.
right as we
Yeah. Yeah.
can. But there's always going to be things to work on and reiterate upon. So yeah, just take that pressure off.
Yeah. Love it. So once you have a brand voice kind of dialed in, what do you do next?
Yeah. So the next thing is writing your headlines,
Okay.
right? So headlines are very difficult to write, even though they are so short and succinct. You have to pack a lot of punch in a very few amount of words, and so kind of going with that same experimentation um, recommendation is also just to take pressure off of yourself that you're going to sit down and write the perfect headline
Yeah.
out of thin air, right? And a lot of people are surprised to hear that sometimes my most favorite headlines are maybe the 15th version of a
Yeah.
headline that I've created, and I think people just think you're going to sit down, it's going to come to you, and then you're just going to keep writing the rest of your content. But
Right.
a lot of times I sit down at every single, because again, I'm going back to the wireframe, so I know exactly where I need headlines, and I know the content around, like what's going to come before it, what's going to come after it,
Yes.
the calls to action. So again, it becomes like I see all of these pieces, and then I know a little bit of, okay, how with this brand voice can I play with the messaging? Can I, focus on a client transformation here, and then
Yeah.
reiterate upon that with a few different pieces of language, and then go, okay, I'm going to maybe move away from that, and maybe I'm going to go with this kind of formula and think about that, and maybe I'll trash that and go in a different direction. And so I look at this as a part of play, right? And I think a lot of times in our work, we can feel, again, especially if we're going with strategy, we feel like we have to be so dialed in and focused. But like just play with it a little bit.
Right.
Think about what's engaging to people. And, if you want to test things, you can always A B test headlines.
Absolutely.
Don't ever feel like you have to just, throw out everything that you've come up with.
Yeah.
If you narrow it down to about 2 to 3 versions, I always tell clients test it.
Yeah.
If you don't know which one to choose, just test it and then let me know what the results are, because I'll be really interested to know,
Yes.
because a lot of times I'll have my own ideas. But it's always really great to have clients that are willing to, again, experiment, because you just don't know until you put it in to practice. But typically I try to have anywhere between 10 to 30 headlines that I'm kind of crafting behind the scenes. And then I'll narrow it down to a good 5 to 10 that I'm actually sharing with clients. And that is one really positive thing I've heard from clients, that instead of me just giving them, like, here's the headline that's going to be on your homepage, what do you think?
Yeah.
You
Right.
know,
Right. Right. Yeah.
instead I'm giving them a few different like ways to think about their messaging, for them to have those internal conversations to go, oh, like this one works on this level, but then this
Yeah.
one does too. So then, okay, how do we then create the best content that happens afterwards? And all of those things I clearly love to play with. So it's a very fun time for a very difficult task, to be honest.
So, a couple things. The
Yeah.
first of which is one of my favorite quotes in copywriting is from David Ogilvy, who says, once you've written your headline, 80 cents out of a dollar in advertising has been spent. And just talking about the importance
Mm,
of that
smart.
headline. And like, if you don't capture the attention in the headline, obviously they don't read anything else. Um,
Yes.
but one of the things that came to my mind as you were talking about sharing these headline ideas with the client is, how frequently do you feel the client can pick the best headline for their business?
Mm.
Again, we're so close to our business. And yes, I'm going to have
True.
biases that are going to be like, oh, I think this is a cool headline. But honestly, should we just go straight to testing and be like, hey, Kayla, honestly, you have probably a really good gut that's going to say, these are the top three, or these are the top five? Should we
Mhm.
just take those straight, to our A/B split tester and be like, let's just test these out?
Yeah. That is such a good question. And so typically what I do as a part of my process is that for especially let's say the homepage, right? Because the homepage headline is so unbelievably important.
Yes.
Usually what I do is, in my Google Doc, I will highlight and in the comments give the strategic reasoning because I love being able to educate my clients and give them a behind the scenes, look into like why did I write this? Where
Yeah.
was I kind of going with that? And so I try to give them that background information and for I would say like 90% of my clients, I kind of say here's kind of like my personal favorite, or
Yeah.
here's like my second favorite. But there are always so often the clients where I feel like it almost benefits me to not necessarily give my outright suggestion,
Okay.
maybe because they're in a certain discovery phase with their messaging where I'm just very curious to know which one that they're thinking about. But I always give, afterwards, if they say, hey, I'm thinking this one,
Yeah.
I would still give my honest
Okay.
suggestion and say, I was actually leaning towards this one for these different reasons, and still give them the strategic
Sure.
reasoning behind why I did it in the first place. But then, if we decided, let's maybe test that version next to this one,
Yep.
then we just can play a little bit and see what works best. And so that's why I think it's a good way to have some of those upfront conversations. And like you said, I mean, the Ogilvy quote,
Yep.
yes, it's very important. I would say with how, scroll obsessed, honestly, all of our people
Yeah.
are now these days and how people interact with websites even so differently than when I first got started 10 years ago, the headline has only become even more important. So
Yeah.
getting that right is very, very crucial. And that's why I spend a lot of time making sure that we're having a lot of those strategic conversations. And of course, the rest of the content matters too.
Yeah.
But I spend, people probably would expect that because headlines are so short, you're spending hardly any time
Yeah.
on it and you're just spending it on, I would say, headlines. I can spend hours
Yeah.
a day just on a couple of headlines because it's that important. So,
I think people really need to let that digest, because I was listening to a copywriter yesterday he has a company that does $200+ million. He's the owner of it, but he spends a lot of his time on the copywriting side. And he said in this interview that he spends 10 times as much time on his
sure.
headlines as he does on the rest, which I was blown away. Like, I understand the importance of it. Like, a couple of these books are copywriting books. Like, I understand the
Sure.
basics. I had no idea that he would have spent so much time just thinking about the headline, just thinking about that hook that's going to get somebody's attention
Mhm.
and get them to read the second sentence and the third one, on and on. So it is critical, and you can't just breeze past that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I have never tried to quantify it to see if it's 10 times for
Sure.
me, but I will say it is certainly, other than strategy, the thing that I spend the most amount of my time on by
Yeah.
far.
Is there a particular angle that you prefer more than others with headlines? What I mean by that is, like, a comparison angle or a before and after type of hook
Mhm.
and headline. Are certain headlines right now where you're like, man, this is kind of my gold nugget a little bit. Like, I feel
Sure.
like I go back to this as a framework on a regular basis.
Yeah, I try to not get too formulaic with
Okay.
it. And the reason being is that, for instance, quite a few of my clients, especially this year, but also at the start of my business, have been from the wedding industry. And
Mm,
I always joke, right? Like, there's only so many ways that you can talk about capturing wedding photos, right?
yeah.
But I think, if you fall back too much on those formulas or those templates, I think it can be a great way to grease the wheels, so to speak. And so I totally am all for, people using that. But I think, must be more of a jumping off point because then I start to feel like I'm almost boxing myself in. And when I work with people that have just really interesting perspectives on industries that, I'm seeing quite often, that allows me to lean more into like, oh, this is the specific way that they serve people really, really well. I want to find something unique to kind of put a spin on. So I guess maybe in some ways, conceptually, I like to put spins on things
Yep.
that people aren't necessarily expecting.
Yeah. Love it.
And that's very, very broad as a way of talking about it, but it's a really cool thing to break it down in a way where, let's say for the wedding
Yeah.
photography business, I worked with a wedding photographer that was so fantastic. And she doesn't spend a lot of time on, capturing the candids. And she is all about big city weddings. She's like, we are going to capture things, boom, 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 boom. Like, I know exactly what you need and you don't. So let me take the lead.
Yeah.
That's very different than your typical
Yeah.
photographer that goes, let me just have you enjoy your day and
Yes.
I'll just capture it exactly how it goes. So to me, I get excited about that as a copywriter because I go, okay, all that language I just said, that's going to be terrible if I say that on a website, right? That's going to turn people away. But there's a way to craft this
Yes.
so that people can understand the very specific way that she directs clients during
Correct.
that. And it's interesting because I have to kind of fill in some of the pieces too, because one of the things that's difficult as a copywriter is a lot of times we don't necessarily see people on the job. And so one thing I would say, and this kind of goes even back before step one is, just when you are working with a copywriter or anybody, be as prepared as a client as possible
Yeah.
so that we can ask those deeper questions, because the better your participation is in those strategy sessions and the better that you can
Yes.
tell us some of those differentiators,
Yep.
it's just going to make our project so much better, so that when you get that copy you go, oh my gosh, this sounds so much better than what I expected. But a lot of clients don't realize, like, you are actually giving us those pieces. It's just
Right.
we're crafting it in a way that's going to make the most sense. So,
I love it.
yeah.
And I can't tell you. So we just signed on with a Facebook ad. They just are creating the ads for our Facebook campaigns. Very expensive, very high end. And obviously we've received lots of briefs before where it's like, okay, fill out these forms. And I mean, these
Mhm.
can take a long time. And as a business owner, you
Yeah.
want to breeze through it as fast as possible. And I had to remind myself, like, listen, I'm paying these guys a lot of money.
Mhm.
I really want to take my time. I want to make sure I'm giving them everything they can to be successful, because ultimately, in a sense, their success is going to depend on all the stuff that I'm providing them right now. If we want to get into the nitty gritty and the nuances of
Yeah.
what makes us special.
Exactly. I'd say nearly 100% of my most successful projects are always because of client involvement.
Okay.
If a client is participating, if a client is responsive, if they're decisive, if they kind of know what they're looking for. And I mean, of course, as a copywriter, I understand sometimes people come to me and they say, I don't know exactly how to communicate what it is I'm looking for, but to see that they are prepared, they're willing to give you those resources, have those conversations, not feel like, okay, we just need to get done as quick as
Right.
possible. When I know it's not treated as a task just to check off of a list, but it's truly that partnership, there is nothing better for that client project. So I'm so glad that you're approaching the Facebook ads. And I can almost guarantee you that the Facebook ads will be more successful because you're doing that.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah, it'll be good. It'll be
It will
so
be.
worth it.
Yeah. So after the headline is written and 80
Yes.
cents of our advertising dollar has been spent, what comes next?
Absolutely. So the next thing is a little bit more philosophical when it comes to kind of approaching your website copy, but it's just a reminder not to make everything about you and your brand. I it's so common, especially I will say in the agency world. I do come from agency world, but it's so common for brands to feel like the website is the best representation of them. So they
Totally.
put their face forward and they do tons of things about, like, we are this and this is us. And it's not necessarily that those pieces aren't important, but it doesn't allow you to connect with that ideal person, because instead of you talking, to them, it's you talking about yourself and just offering that up to them. And
Yep.
it's just not necessarily creating that connection. And so there are some industries that do this certainly better than others. And I think it's just important, though, to remember that, when you are starting by copywriting any sort of page, especially in that, kind of introduction area, are you talking specifically to your audience? Are you letting them know that they're in the right place? Are you either calling them out specifically by, like, okay, if you only work with people who are in this stage, or if you have a specific way that you kind of title the people that you work with, like, just weaving all of those things in. Because first of all, as you and I have talked about, you never know what page people are landing on.
Right.
It doesn't mean that everybody's going to be funneled through your homepage. Many people likely will, but I think it's important just to make sure that you're always talking to that person and just kind of reintroducing them into the narrative and the dialogue, because otherwise it just becomes basically like a calling card rap sheet of all the things that you're really great at.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily put your people first.
That's right. I mean, I'll never forget one of my intros into copywriting. I had a copywriter review our stuff many years ago, and they did a control F search on our
Mm.
page and did the word I,
Ah,
and then did the same thing and did the word you. And,
yes.
we had like no references to you and a bunch of references to I. And, I was like, wow. And they're like, why don't you start by talking to your
Mhm.
customer? This is
Yes.
how we help you.
Yes. And that is such a that I love that you said that, because that's such a simple and tangible exercise to really be able to decipher
Yeah.
how much more am I talking about I or we than I am about you.
Mm.
So I love that you suggested that. I think that's a great way to kind of self audit even
Yeah.
before you work with someone, to kind of understand where that's coming from.
Yeah, completely. Okay. So
Mhm.
once we've kind of honed that in and we're talking to our customer, what's next?
Yeah. So the next thing is definitely to focus on the benefits rather than the features. And this
Yeah.
is something that people say all the time in the copywriter world for sure, but it's a tried and true practice for a reason, because if you are focusing more on, especially if you're in the service industry, the deliverables of what you're giving, or even for e-commerce, if you're focusing so much effort on, breaking down every single little feature that's in your
Sure.
product description, but you're not necessarily showcasing some of the benefits of what people have seen, or in some industries like coaching, it would be a lot more about the transformations, and
Yes.
other industries it might be about the case studies. Whatever that looks like, it's really important to weave in those benefits first, because people are going to want to know what is possible, and
Mhm.
you're trying to kind of, through your copy, fill in what are those blanks, because typically on most sales pages, you're going to start by talking to your audience, kind of really strategically weave in some of what we would consider pain points, right? Or the different problems or agitations that people are having.
Yep.
Some industries do this a little bit more directly than others. So
Yep.
I always like to kind of understand the style that people are looking at before writing. But then as you progress through, you don't want to just have people sit in that place of a pain point. You want to be able to showcase that you've got some sort of benefit or some solution. So that's kind of where you get to be a little bit more creative about what's possible. And you can even weave in some of those testimonials, as we talked about, or if there's a case study, people love to read about the case study that I have on my website about this very project we're talking about,
Sure.
where, a gal went from 72,000 to 1.9 million in a year, because it absolutely is possible, with weaving in a little bit more of her personal story and some other different strategic steps that we took for her e-commerce business. But it's so cool to see clients start to go, oh, so when I've read other sales pages that I personally have taken action
Yes.
on, that's what they're doing. Like, that's the psychology behind it. And again, you don't have to be so formulaic about it, where it has to be this, then this, then this, and
Sure.
this, kind of work off of that. But it is nice to have a little bit of a guide or a framework to it, so that when you are crafting this, you kind of know, okay, maybe this is a natural place where we would put a testimonial, or this is a natural place where we would, showcase some of the benefits before we go into, okay, this is everything that's included in the package,
Yeah.
right? You never want to say all of the specific details about, coaching calls this, and you
Yes.
get a invite to a mastermind this immediately above the fold on your website
Right.
page, because people want to be able to read more about what the benefit is of working with you in the first place.
And how important is it to include like all of your benefits versus maybe just one main benefit? Because most of the people that are listening to this, they have a service business or they sell a product, and there's probably not just
Mhm.
one benefit. But do you want to go on and on about all the benefits that your product offers?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I would say the short answer is no. You don't want to go on and on. But I think what's so great about a lot of people, right, will have multiple offers. And so instead of trying to put and like smack together all of these benefits to one, start to really realize, okay, based on these different offers, what are those key benefits for each of them? What is also the reason why they're differentiated from each other? And based on those benefits, I usually like to narrow it down to probably around 3 to 4.
Okay.
I'm a huge fan in website design of 3 column layouts. I just love them. So if you put a really nice illustration or icon and you've got, some of those benefits that you want to introduce in a way that again is very skimmable and easy to keep, reading, introduces that imagery. So again, that's more of that website strategy brain that's coming in. But it's really great to think about that rather than feeling like, I think in some industries you'll see benefit section where it's like 2 columns and maybe the whole entire column is
Right.
listed with like 8 bullet points each. Nobody's going to read that. And
Yeah.
at that point, if you're putting in too many benefits, people basically are going to feel like each one of those benefits is less valuable
Okay.
because there's so many,
Yes.
right? And so if you're saying, more freedom, more flexibility, all of these other things, that kind of doesn't seem to mean as much when there's eight other things that they'll just, kind of skim by. But if you really take the time to kind of digest, maybe even pair it again with an icon or illustration and talk about like not only freedom or flexibility, but like what did that look like in my life or what does that look like in my business? Give me something that feels tangible. And then if you can also pair that with either a case study or a testimonial of somebody who's actually been able to showcase through their own social proof that is something that you help them with,
Love
that's
it.
great.
Yeah,
Super strategic.
absolutely. Yeah. More is not always better.
Exactly. So just being able to self edit sometimes, right? And I know one of the top quotes is kill your darlings, right? It's that whole idea of, you might have an idea that you think is the bee's knees and it's wonderful. But sometimes when you get into the editing process and you're writing everything down, there are certain things that just have to be cut on that like cutting room floor. And it's
Yep.
hard, but the more that you do it, the easier it will get for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So once we've honed in our benefits, what is coming
Mhm.
next?
Yeah. So, we've already talked about this a little bit, but just that whole idea of, once you are packaging everything together, going through that revision stage, which is usually something that I take a whole week on just to really make sure that my clients are able to review everything. And then I'm able to give them those suggestions and some of that feedback. I really, again, like to look at it as an experiment. And one of my mottos, I even have it on my website too, as a part of my philosophy, is like, when in doubt, test it out. Like, you
Mhm.
just don't know what's going to work best until you put it into action. So,
Yeah.
again, that's when I think that heat mapping tools can come into play. And if you want to be able to have kind of like a small consumer group that is able to look through it, almost like a focus group, but
Right.
just kind of
Right.
auditing your website, you can totally do that as well. And I think it can be helpful for people that you may be connected with, or even, you know, past ideal clients to look through it, because you likely are going to want to have more people who resemble those past, ideal customers or
Yeah.
consumers. So to go to them and maybe you can even, not just say, hey, can you do this for me?
Yeah.
But instead, give them something in return. Give them a gift of your
Absolutely.
time. Give them a discount. Give them something that incentivizes them to give you that really valuable feedback. And also, if there's a specific type of feedback you're looking for, ask them for that. I can't
Right.
tell you how many times people will, try to ask for a testimonial, but they're not actually saying, okay, say about this part of my experience,
Sure.
or do you want a testimonial about the result? Do you want it about the process? Like, there's so many different ways that we can kind of guide people towards
I
what we're
love that.
looking for. And so if you have some sort of feedback, give them something in return that gets them excited, but then also really be specific about the type of feedback that you're looking for.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look like you just sending the whole entire website and people are just
Right.
overwhelmed and don't necessarily know exactly how to help.
Exactly. I love that. No, and that's one of the things that we've done with our e-commerce brand. It's obviously super easy. If the product is 30, 40, $50, hey, we'll give you some free
Yeah.
product in exchange for some feedback. And we get great feedback from that. I mean, I'm surprised more businesses don't do it.
It's so true. I think it's because it takes that extra intentional step.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to set aside some time for it, but figuring out what that follow up process looks like. And I think it does take that internal commitment to not only evolving things over time, but also just improving it,
Yeah.
right? Because it's easy to launch a website, get really excited about it. And, we throw the confetti, we have the balloons, everything's awesome. And then it just sits there
Mm.
and you're not necessarily reiterating upon it. And I don't necessarily think that you need to, of course, you don't need to update your your website and rehaul it, every few months. That's not at
Right.
all what we're looking for. But instead, I really would love to just inspire others to get curious about their website instead of, again, looking at it as a project just to get done and check it off. And whew, well, that took a lot of work. Now we're able
Right.
to move on. Start to look at, okay, now that it's in process, and we can track some of the progress. Like, what does this actually look like? How can we improve this over time? And so that I really do enjoy. I don't get to do that with all of my clients, but some of my clients will bring me back in, 6 months later, a year later,
Exactly.
5 years later, and just continue looking at those things strategically, digging into the data. And I love that work too.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, Kayla, one of the questions I want to ask is, what do you feel like the top 1% of your clients have in common? Obviously, not every client sees,
Mhm.
a growth from 70 something thousand to almost $2 million in a period of a year. But what
Sure.
do those few clients have in common?
We touched on this, but I think a lot of them just are very decisive people. And I
Mhm.
always say I love working with decisive people. There's nothing like it. And I think it goes hand in hand with some of the client involvement and preparation and communication we talked about. But I really love working with people that instead of, me sending over some copy for them to review and them commenting and saying, like, I don't like this word, or something about this feels off, like those types of broad things. If people are able to say, hey, I actually think that this word would be better here, or
Yeah.
saying, like, I don't necessarily think this fits this part of our tone of voice, could we maybe bring this aspect of it in? People who are able to be very decisive in understanding not just that they don't like something, but exactly why that is, then it starts to feel like that really cool collaboration, because I always want clients to participate. And I think something that a lot of people think is a successful copywriting project would be if there was no edits at all, right? The
Mm,
client just said,
yeah.
yep, everything looks awesome. You killed it. That's great. And I mean, when I was first getting started in my career, that felt awesome.
Sure.
But I started to realize those clients probably aren't necessarily doing that hard internal work of really
Right.
figuring out what's going to be best for them. And so I would much rather have that decisive feedback where I
Yeah.
can tell that they're committed to that end product, and I want to be able to hear their voice, because I absolutely believe that people should have a voice in the collaboration. But it's just really important to have those people that you're able to get some of that feedback from. But one of the things I will say that I do, it's kind of like a little sneaky behind the scenes thing, is, again, if I'm thinking strategically, that's the type of feedback I want.
Yeah.
That's what I want to guide people to give me. And so a lot of times I will send over, along with the website copy, I have this really simple editing guidelines doc that I send over to all my clients,
Hmm.
that just in less than a page describes, this is the type of feedback that isn't as helpful. This is the feedback that is.
I
And so it
love
kind of
it.
help, right? It's kind of helping them understand, oh, when I am going through this and suggesting some edits, this is what's a little bit more helpful for the project. And so that I can get to that end result, and they can too, in a much more smooth and streamlined way, while also helping them see the value of collaborating with me in that part of the process. 'Cause, like, in the revisions phase, you just want to bring it on home.
Yes. No, I love that. And that's so true. And I've thought about that recently with some of our clients. Like, we have to be specific about what we're looking for. And if we keep it vague
Mhm.
and they keep it vague, then nobody wins.
Exactly, exactly. So specific is good.
Yeah.
Brevity, as we talked about, is great, but just simple and to the point. That's all we need. And clarity.
Yeah. I love
Tried and
it.
true.
Kayla, this has been fantastic. For people who want to connect with you, what's the best place for them to do that?
Absolutely. So my website, of course, at kaylahollatz.com. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter, just at my name as well. But excited to connect with people from the Growth Boss community.
Awesome. Thanks so much again for joining us today.